I'd really like to thank everyone for supporting my channel, for coming and watching all the projects that I've been posting, for your likes and your comments, and especially for those who have been subscribing. I'm just really grateful and appreciative of all the support that you guys have been giving me. If you haven't subscribed yet, I'd love it if you'd subscribe to my channel. I post a new video every week. I'd love for any suggestions on content you'd like to see, any encaustic techniques or questions that you have, just put them in the comments and I will do my best to give you guys the things that you want. So about this project, this one was really fun. I don't know if any of you have been following me for very long, but I've always been a scrapbooker and a mixed media artist for years before I even started with encaustic painting. And so that's kind of my first love is creating scrapbook layouts and doing really intricate things with photos and flowers and just creating these amazing layouts with chipboard and different embellishments. So I I haven't really tried to incorporate that into my encaustic work at all, but I thought it was time to just kind of experiment and see if I would even be able to do it. If there was a way that I could kind of incorporate my love of scrapbooking and mixed media with my encaustic work. So this is my attempt to kind of do that. I I wanted to use a lot of the embellishments that I use in my scrapbook layouts. So this is chipboard from Scrapbooking. I have no idea if I pronounced that correctly, so I apologize if anyone from the company is watching, but it's a European chipboard company, but they have fantastic designs. Anyway, but their chipboard is white, and I wanted to kind of start out with a white base. I've stained it with alcohol ink to kind of match the white and purple and the red and pink flowers that I'm going to be using later on. What I've done to adhere it to the surface is I've dipped the chipboard pieces in wax. So I have a kind of a larger container on my griddle of wax and I just took some tweezers and just kind of dipped it in there. I don't like when I add embellishments like this to the surface of my encaustic paintings. I don't like brushing wax over the surface because I feel like it loads it up with just tons of wax and buries the embellishment, and it's harder to see, it's harder to work with. So these chipboard pieces are paper, and I knew the wax would soak in pretty quickly, so I just dipped them straight into the wax and then added them to the surface. And then going back and fusing over it, there's still plenty of wax to fuse to the surface beneath the chipboard, but not enough to just kind of overload it and bury it underneath a pile of wax. So once the surface dried, I wanted to kind of lay out all my flowers just to kind of see what kind of layout, what kind of colors would look the best. These are, well, most of these are flowers from Prima Marketing. There's also some of the Michaels brand, Recollections. And these paper flowers are really fun to work with. I've never used them in my encaustic work before because they're so three-dimensional. They're especially the biggest ones. They're just very large. They stick at least an inch off the surface in many cases. So this was kind of the big test to see if I could incorporate them into encaustic work in a way that would be successful, because obviously I'm not going to use a ton of wax to, bury them under the surface. I wanted to just use enough wax to adhere them to the surface without burying them. So they're still going to be very much on top of the surface of the painting. This is cheesecloth. I kind of cut up a piece and am working with it, staining it with alcohol ink. The flowers on top of the chipboard, it was just kind of missing another mixed media element. So I work with cheesecloth a lot in my art journal and in some of my layouts. So I wanted to try to do it here, and it's a fabric, so I wanted to incorporate it into the surface, but just using wax and a few areas to adhere it to the surface so that the cheesecloth would still be kind of free and open in a lot of places, but part of the surface adhered to the surface in just a few places. It adds fun texture and color. It's just a neat kind of background element to add. One of the things I noticed while I was fusing it is cheesecloth is a very, very lightweight, porous fabric. And using my heat gun to fuse the wax, it makes the fabric very hot. And because it's so porous, because it's so lightweight, it could easily, well, I imagine it could easily burst into flames. I didn't try to test that theory, but it did start to smoke a couple times. So if you try to do this, be very, 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 very careful. Just hit it, the areas that you're fusing with your heat gun just for a couple of seconds and back off, and then do that a few times to avoid any smoking or anything like that. You don't want it to get too hot. So now's the big moment. I'm adding my flowers. And at first I started dipping just the bottom of the flower in the wax. But after the first two or three, I realized that wasn't really going to work. There wasn't enough wax. It was giving this two-tone, because dipping it in wax, it kind of, it's like you were wetting the flowers. And so the colors get darker. So it was kind of giving this two-tone effect to the flowers that I didn't really like. So after the first two or three, I decided to just dip them all the way into the wax. And the same thing applies with the flowers as does with the cheesecloth. If you keep your heat gun on them for too long while you're fusing, you can get smoke and I imagine flames if you do it for too long. So just be careful not to keep your heat gun on the flowers for too long at a time. You can always come back and fuse it multiple times. Just don't do it for more than a couple seconds at a time to keep the flowers from getting too hot. So I'm done adding the flowers, but I'm going back over it with some additional wax on the ones that I didn't dip completely, but also on most of the other ones, especially the larger ones. Just dripping some in the middle and then fusing it down so that there's extra wax. Make sure that I've fused everything sufficiently and that the flowers are really adhered to the surface. I let it cool and now I'm testing them out, just making sure that they're not moving at all, and they were all stuck very hard to the surface, which was really nice. I didn't have to refuse any of them. So it needed a few more splashes of color though, especially in the negative white space. So I'm using India ink now and just kind of splashing it onto the surface. India ink, it pools on the surface of the wax. So I didn't really want to like brush it or anything. I just wanted to do the splashes and let it kind of beat up on the surface and dry. Because once India ink dries on encaustic wax, it's fast. It's not going to rub off or anything. My flowers needed a little bit of white, so I'm splashing some white India ink on them, and then kind of adding a little bit of white to the edges of all the petals. And it gives them this really neat kind of frosted look, which is cool, especially since the wax makes the flowers look wet, um, almost like they're soaking or floating in water, something like that. The white almost kind of makes them look frozen, like they're frozen in a pond or something, or on the surface of water. It's a really neat effect. So I let the India ink dry overnight because some of the larger beads, they take a while to dry. But this is a quote, one of my favorite quotes about creation, the creative process. And I wanted to add it to the surface, but I couldn't glue it, and I didn't want to try to use wax or anything because putting it over the flowers, or it just didn't seem like a good idea. So what I did is it's printed on cardstock and then adhered to a cardstock mat, and I'm using push pins in the corners and just kind of hammering them into the surface. So this quote is kind of lifted off the surface. I'm using gel medium right here at underneath the push pins to make sure that the paper doesn't go anywhere, it doesn't slide down the push pins or anything. And this is adding a little bit of gel medium to where the push pins are pushing through the back of my wood board, just to give it a little extra security. So that was this project. It was really fun and a lot more successful than I anticipated. Of course, I will say one thing, encaustic wax goes through a curing process. So over the next few months, I'm going to be watching this piece to see if there's any kind of bloom that happens, especially with the flowers, if I have to buff it or anything like that. So I'm not completely sure that this was a success. I need to keep an eye on it and just kind of see what the wax does in the next few months. But I'm really happy with it so far. I I anticipate that if anything like that happens, that I'll be able to fix it, work on it. So stay tuned. I'll give you an update if anything happens. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to hit subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.